Welcome back to the podcast where swimming and science and the sea converge. Today I'm joined by Dr Kate Baldwin, a physiotherapist, sports scientist and former professional triathlete with extensive experience working with endurance athletes. Kate completed her PhD exploring strength training and long-distance triathletes, and across her career she has combined research, clinical practice and personal experience in endurance sport. Many listeners may also appreciate that Kate has a strong connection to the open water community, including completing a solo crossing of the Rottnest Channel. These days, Kate works as a physio with endurance athletes, as well as strength and conditioning, and is also the host of the podcast DistanceDr In Practice, where she shares insights on injury management and performance for runners and endurance athletes. In this episode, we're going to explore common injuries in swimmers, how athletes can prevent them, the role of strength training in endurance sport, and importantly, how swimmers can recognise when it's time to seek help from a physio. Kate, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Grant. Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. It has been a while since we've had a chat, so it's really nice to have you here to talk to today.
Yes, I know. Thank you.
So before we dive into the physio and the science side of things, can you tell us a bit about your own background in endurance sport and how you ended up working with endurance athletes?
Yeah, I just always grew up just loving sport, any sport actually. I remember just as a kid, we would come home from school, just swim all afternoon in the pool, hop on our bikes, ride our bikes back down to school where they had a big oval, run around. So I guess it always stemmed just from being active as a kid. And then it wasn't really until I got into uni that I really got into sport, and I guess I couldn't really decide, like any typical triathlete, got into swimming, cycling and running. That took off into triathlon, and then unfortunately I have endometriosis, which really flared up when I did a lot of running. So that's like a pelvic disease. And from that, I took quite a bit of time off running, but loved my endurance sports. And that's how I leaned more into the swimming, because I loved swimming from doing triathlon. And that's how I ended up thinking, what's one of the tougher events I could do? Do you know what? Roto Solo. That's a very WA thing to do. So I signed up I did the Port to Pub in 2019, and I can honestly say, hand on heart, that was the fittest and healthiest I've ever felt in my endurance career, was actually having done Port to Pub. I could thankfully handle the really big swim loads, and being low impact, I found it really easy on my body. So that was where I leaned more into swimming. Then I had a couple of kids, so I've sort of dabbled back into running and everything again now. But yeah, that's how I leaned more into the open water swimming scene, and I really loved it. I loved being no one in it, to be honest. I loved just going to races and just not having any pressure, and just knowing each time I would get a PB, because it was still new building up those distances. So it was, yeah, one of the highlights of all the sporting stuff I've ever done.
Now you're back in the country because you've been away for a little while. Have you got the number plates back out?
Oh, absolutely, Grant. Do you know, we bought a new car and it came with, obviously, not my number plates. And the whole time we were overseas, I was panicking that our number plates would get lost somehow. No, we stored them very safely with the Department of Transport. I don't know if that's safe or not, but Nick kept saying to me, my husband, no, we're not going to put them on until we get our longer term car. And as soon as he bought the car, Grant, I made him drive down to the Department of Transport, pick those up. But you know, the only time that anyone has ever mentioned anything about doing the Roto crossing is when Nick is with the car and they ask him. No one has ever asked me, and I'm just waiting for the day. So if anyone sees me on the street, sees I've got the Port to Pub ones as well. So I'm 067. So I like being the really low numbers. Oh no,
Yeah.
064, sorry. If anyone sees me, please just holler me down and go, wow, Kate, did you do Roto solo? So I can have my moment of glory.
You did your physio degree and then you went on and did some research. Why did you head into the research side of things?
Yeah, I probably was really heavily influenced in a little bit more of a negative experience as my first job in private practice as physio. I was in a job that I had 20-minute consults with patients, and it just wasn't enough time. I couldn't do what I felt like I needed to do. I remember talking to Rob Merrills, Grant, that you know, back at Notre Dame University, who is really the person that got me into research, because he sort of said to me, well, come back and do your research. You know, you got offered honours, come back and actually do it, because you're obviously not happy really where you are. And I did. And that is really how I got into it. I knew I wanted to work with athletes. So that's how I got into the research, and obviously how I met you as well. And then I guess over the duration of my PhD, I sort of realized there's not a lot of people doing strength training for endurance athletes, right? Whether that's swimming, cycling, or running. And after my intervention, I guess the word had kind of spread through WA of what we were doing. And I had multiple people reach out, say, I want strength training. And then it just grew from there. We ended up getting busy enough. We fortunately could open up our own practice, and it was just a big warehouse with a gym. And often I would have people walk in and go, oh, no, hang on, I'm looking for the physio clinic. And I'd go, no, this is it. Come on in. I know it looks intimidating because we've got a whole lot of equipment, but you're in the right place. And yeah, that's really how it grew. And then over time, I've just been able to now almost exclusively work with endurance athletes. And I think people differentiate strength training and physio, but I really think they go hand in hand, because I think that physios should be very competent at prescribing strength training if they work with endurance athletes, because massage, needling, those kind of things are adjuncts, and they should always be second line treatment after appropriate training load management and loaded exercise prescription. So I still think of strength training and physio as the same thing in my mind.
I guess you also have a sports science background as well,
Yeah.
which would certainly highlight those aspects. When you think about the endurance athletes though, and their understanding and their mindset around this, where do they fit in, and how do you try and maybe change or get them to come on board?
Yeah, I often find, and I'm going to talk more exclusively about swimmers, obviously, given this pod, that when I work with swimmers, they come in and I find they've been almost given the good old traditional TheraBand, internal, external rotation, 3 to 4 sets of high repetition work. And they adapt to that so quickly, given the amount of substantial swim training that they do. So, where I find I fit in is I often get the swimmers who have injuries that aren't getting better, or they hit a particular ceiling when it comes to I can do this many swim Ks, but if I go beyond that, my shoulders flare up or my neck gets sore, whatever their injury is. So I think that this is sort of physio evolved for swimmers, where the next level beyond those traditional rehab exercises, you think about how many strokes you take, for example, with Roto Solo or just any swim session, it's thousands. And your high rep work is just not enough to create a stimulus for your body to be able to handle that. Or I find that traditional physios are isolated into internal external rotation of the shoulder. When you look at the shoulder joint, as you know, it's very complex. We think of it as a ball and socket joint, which it is, but it's more like a ball on a seal's nose rather than a proper ball and socket joint. And you think of all the muscles that play a role in stabilizing that to create a powerful swim stroke and also to prevent injuries. It's quite complex, and you need to have a bigger focus than just a banded rotation.
So, if we were to think about balancing training and injury management in this space, how much would you sort of allocate time towards that injury management or prevention?
Yeah. I would suggest to my swimmers that it's 2 times a week for your strength training, your injury prevention and management perspective is generally the bare minimum to make a meaningful difference. 3 times a week of doing your specific exercises, I'd say, is optimal. But then we know the big Ks that swimmers do in training. So I think that the twice a week, if you have the loads right in your strength training program and your rehab program, if you're doing loads that are too light and you're not creating a stimulus, it doesn't matter how many times a week you do that, you're not actually going to get the meaningful change. So I think a good way to look at it is once a week will maintain changes, twice a week will significantly improve changes, 3 times a week is optimal, 4 times only if you're really injured and you're taking time out of the pool and you want to substitute it with your rehab, then sure. But beyond that is almost just going to be too much. But you could get those numbers right depending on your phase. But if you don't have the exercise choices and the loads right, it doesn't matter how often you do it. And I think that's often what people miss when it comes to doing their rehab or strengthening to prevent injuries.
So, if we consider the swimmer, what are the common injuries that you would typically see with these swimmers or endurance athletes that swim? So, your Ironman triathletes, etc. I assume they'd have similar types of injuries.
Yeah.
What sort of body parts are we sort of talking about most of the time?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, your most common one is going to be your shoulder impingement or any form of, we just call it subacromial pain syndrome. So that's your space underneath your acromion in your shoulder. So your traditional shoulder pain that you would most commonly see in your swimmers. is the most common one that I generally see. You'll have a flow on as well to neck pain, but also lower back pain is really common in swimmers too. And I feel like that's often forgotten about. And this is probably more in the triathlete scene that I see who do a lot of swimming rather than traditional open water swimmers. And I personally find that the lower back pain often comes from triathletes using wetsuits, and it tends to pull them into that really excessive lumbar lordosis. And then they'll hop out of the water and then go and hop on the bike, and then they end up in the opposite position, and then they end up with pain. And often I find that triathletes find that back pain comes on when they're doing brick sessions or only on race day because they're not used to wearing their wetsuit and being in that different position in the water. So that is one that I do think is often forgotten about in open water swimming, is often back pain as well. And, we do forget how often or how much we work through our core, and our core not only being our abdominal muscles, but our back as well. And of course, our lats come down and insert on that thoracolumbar fascia, which is that nice, strong, stiff fascia that stabilizes through the back. So if you do have that weakness in your lats, that can have a flow-on effect down through the lower back as well. So they're the most common sites of injuries that I generally work around when it comes to open water swimmers or triathletes who do a lot of swimming too.
So, first of all, it's interesting you mentioned around the lower back, etc., and the potential relationship with wetsuits. We had Ryan Everton on a few weeks ago from Formidable S&C, and he
Mm.
talked about, especially for the roto swimmers, wearing their suits and being quite stiff and having issues around, more often than not, the hip flexors because the different body position potentially with those suits. Are there any common mistakes that swimmers might make that might lead to those problems?
As always, it's going to be training load error issues. And people go, oh, that's such a generic response, but that's what it is at the end of the day. It's just doing too much too quickly without adequate recovery. And you can look at all of the different factors in this. And there's also things outside of literally just your training load. So you're looking at obviously your overall volume, but you've got to look at your intensity as well. Of course, your technique and your biomechanics is going to come into that hugely as well. But let's assume that we're working with swimmers who have been swimming for a while, and let's assume in those athletes that they have quite good swimming technique. But it's important to point out, even if you feel like your swimming technique is good, if you've had a swim analysis, that can change in the open water, and that can also change obviously as you fatigue as well. I see that a lot with my swimmers, cyclists, and runners. So the most common mistake, and people go, oh, Kate, such a boring answer, but it's training load errors. And that is because generally swimmers sustain overuse injuries, or training load error injuries, I call them, to really drill home to swimmers that it was an error in your training load. And there's so many different factors to training load though. Obviously you have your overall volume, you've got a change in intensity, and your technique is obviously going to play a role in that. But when we think about technique, often we think, well, I've had a swim analysis, I've been swimming for years, I know my technique is good. But if you then take a swimmer who's used to shorter distances and then they're building up to longer durations, then often that technique will falter due to, weakness through particular muscles or just that general fatigue that happens, or put them in choppier conditions or whatever that may be. You may have some biomechanical involvement there as well. So they're your more specific training load error issues that contribute to injuries. But then I think what's often forgotten about, we always look at training load error, but we forget about the person. So you look at all these numbers, but then you also have a human being in front of you, and they may be potentially a younger swimmer who is going through year 11 and 12 exams, or you might have someone who's just started at university, or you might have an adult. Like when I did the roto crossing, I was running the business and I was just a really, really busy. I know if I were to do it now, lack of sleep would be a big contributing factor, having two young kids. So sleep, stress, and all of these other life factors. Actually, there was a study that came out literally only a couple of months ago that showed that sleep in itself was an independent risk factor for injuries. Train load error and everything aside, it was, a decrease in sleep. And I know that stress is the same as well. So if you have potentially even an increase in, let's say, intensity or volume from your swim training, and say you could normally handle that increase, but then if you compound that with, say, a life stressful event or a lack of sleep over a couple of days, you put those things together, and that is what is going to contribute to your injuries. So that is generally what I find with athletes, and often it's really nitpicky. Often I have to sit down with athletes and go, okay, let's actually write this out. And sometimes it's not blaringly obvious. We think with overuse or train load error injuries, you think it must be this big sudden increase. Oh, I went from this many Ks a week to this one, but that's not always the case. It's generally the smaller things that compound. And then then it's also not even the things the week before, it's a couple of weeks before, and you go, oh, hang on, it's this, and then we didn't correct it, and that's now resulted in an injury. So that's it, I guess, in a nutshell.
We do think about the training load. You talk about all the other aspects that sometimes we don't always consider. But that's where I think a coach or someone external can look at all those components and put them all together to be able to provide feedback to the athlete.
100%. That's where I see a lot of these like app-based training platforms, and sometimes they might have the algorithm right when it comes to your training load, but they haven't asked how you slept, or they don't know that you have exams coming up, or they don't know that something significant and negative has happened in your life and you can't train the loads that you normally could, or that you've just recovered from a cold, or your kids are at home from school for the week because they've got a cold, or whatever it is. These things do make a meaningful difference to your training. So that's where having a coach really, I feel like you just can't replace that. And a coach you can talk to about that, right? Or a coach where if you see them on the side of the pool, they look at you and they go, no offense, but you don't look very good. And you go, oh, do you know what? That's not what I wanted to hear, but you're right. I don't feel good at all. And then they modify things, and you can't put a price on that. That is honestly, if you've got a coach like that, you cling on to them because that's what will help you stay relatively injury free. Then also sometimes injuries are also just bad luck. And there is no denying that there's an element to that. Some people are more susceptible to injuries, whether that's lifestyle factors or biomechanical factors or anything else. Sometimes you can feel like you do everything right, but every now and again, things do just happen. So as long as we manage them early, you can generally nip them in the bud and keep on swimming.
So you've covered a few points here, but if swimmers want to stay healthy and keep training consistently, what are the key things they should focus on? You've mentioned sleep, you've mentioned load management. What other things should we consider?
Eating is a big one. My favorite one, actually. I was very fortunate when I did Rottnest. Actually, do you know the reason I ended up doing port to pub was because I'd booked our honeymoon and realized I'd booked it over the Channel swim date and went, whoops. And then I thought, I probably can't tell my new husband prioritizing the Rottnest swim over our honeymoon. So I decided to change it to port to pub. It was great because on our honeymoon, I ate all the food. It was fantastic. But obviously, getting in, first of all, just enough calories is key, and making sure you don't do any of your sessions fasted, which is really hard because obviously a lot of swim sessions are early morning, but making sure that you're taking nutrition before you get to the pool deck and then recovering straight away after. So yeah, with your training load management, you're managing your stress and your sleep, you're taking in enough calories. Also, just being honest, if you do have any niggles or anything like that, just keeping track of them, not overthinking them, but just monitoring them is obviously really important. And then of course I'm putting in there your strength training and your rehab or your prehab if you don't currently have any injuries, not only for injury prevention, but for your performance side of it as well, is really important. And then I think also not just only purely solely focusing on the event. I think making sure that you have a really nice balance with other things in your life really is the key to long-term success. I think where people get mixed up is they'll see athletes do really well at one race and they'll go, oh, look, they were fixated on that, or everything in their life was on that. But if you want to open water swim for a long time, you've got to find that balance with everything else, with your work, your family, your relationships, and swimming, and then having that nice holistic balance as much as you can. As you get closer to race day, sure, that balance is going to tip, right? But still making sure that you have an overall balance, I think, is really, really important too.
So following up with that, one of those comments around strength training. So your PhD looked at strength training in long distance triathletes.
Mhm.
What did that work show about the importance of strength work for endurance athletes?
Yeah, so funnily enough, we didn't actually see a significant improvement in swim time from our strength training intervention. Damn. We did see a significant improvement in cycling economy and running economy. But if I'm being completely honest, I knew that a lot of improvements in swimming also came from swim technique, and we weren't giving any swim technique advice because that wasn't part of our intervention. We didn't want to skew any results, as you know, Grant. So I feel like we didn't see those improvements in swimmers too based on my exercise choices. I focused the majority of the strength training intervention on exercises I knew would make a difference to cycling and running, and we did see those significant improvements. And also that we only measured swim time, which is over a 1,500-meter swim. So there's so much pacing and everything else involved because they were doing the bike and run after. So it wasn't obviously exclusively on swimmers there, but that was our results. But I do feel like the discussion is that I definitely didn't structure that program. In fact, I think from memory, we did 5 strength training exercises and only one of them had a slight bias of any form of upper body, and it was like a bent over row, which is a great exercise choice still for swimmers, but that in itself twice a week may not be the biggest thing to improve swim performance.
Your project was about improving triathlon performance and
Exactly.
using strength training for that. And as you say, the swim is a relatively small component to that long course event that you were targeting. So you did find that using strength training for these endurance athletes was beneficial.
Yes.
A lot of endurance athletes sometimes avoid the gym and strength training.
Yeah. Well, that was the first study was, do you do strength training? Yes or no? And if yes, what did you do? And if no, why not? And the biggest thing, well, actually, it was almost equal for the first 2 reasons. And the first one was time restraints, which completely understandable because especially if you're doing long distance, whether it be swim, bike, run, or all 3 with triathlon, time is hard to fit in the gym session around your other endurance training sessions. But interestingly, in the athletes who reported time restraints, they didn't report working more or training more because we also looked at the hours that they spent training and working and sleeping, and there was no difference in those. So I was sort of like, it's perceived time barriers. I don't think they just sort of prioritized it or made the time. And then that was, I think, reported in 56% of participants. And then in 54% of participants was that they didn't know what to do. And this is what I find when people have decided, I am going to make the time to strength train, then they go, okay, here we go. And then they don't know what to do when they go in the gym because there is so much conflicting information out there. And then I find they do get stuck in the generic kind of 3 sets of 10 to 12 reps, moderate kind of weight. And they do these and then they get a little bit sore and then they don't really get any adaptations, or they've picked kind of more generic exercises and then go, I've given up the time, the effort. I feel like it's only making me fatigued for my swim training. I'm not really feeling any different. I'm not really happy about it. And then they stop. And that's more anecdotally from what I find, but it did tie in with the findings of that first study. So it is generally those time restraints. And then when they do make the time, they don't know what to do in the gym. And they said they didn't know what to do in terms of exercise choices, how to progress them, and technique. They were the 3 when we asked, if you don't know what to do, what was it? They were the 3 main things.
So then what would you suggest in this open water swimming population? What exercises would you recommend, and potentially what sort of intensities would we be looking at to get the benefits that we're looking for within this sort of sport?
I'll start with my general disclaimer that, of course, it depends. It depends on every athlete and their strengths and weaknesses, if they have any current injuries. But here's some general ones that I would include. I would always start the strength training program off, obviously, with their warm up. But in that warm up, that's where I would tie in the muscular endurance motor control kind of exercises. So I would pick things, for example, like a scapular push up. In fact, the serratus anterior muscle, which is the only muscle that originates from the shoulder blade and actually then inserts onto the thoracic area, so it inserts onto the ribs, it's the only muscle that does that. So it plays a huge role in stabilizing the scapula, which obviously the tip of the scapula, you've got your acromion, and underneath that is that subacromial pain syndrome. So that's things like a shoulder impingement, right? So if you can stabilize that acromion, you're keeping that space open, you're less likely to get your typical shoulder impingement or your tendinopathy through your subscap there. So a huge part of looking after that is working on the serratus anterior muscle. And I know this is hard because it's not a podcast. I would normally get out my little shoulder blade and explain this to people. But I always find that that's missing from swimmers' programs, and it blows my mind, or any form of exercises that work on just stabilizing through the scapula, because it's not only that acromion, then you've also got your glenoid fossa, which is the cup or the socket of the ball and socket joint that is the shoulder. But like I said before, you sort of think about that ball on a seal's nose or a golf ball on a tee, that's more like what your shoulder joint looks like. So if you can stabilize the T, okay, or the seal's nose, you're going to be able to create a lot more stability through there to generate power too. So anything that originates or inserts on the scapula is super important. So that serratus anterior muscle through doing a scapular push-up, I would almost put a form of that in almost all swimmers' programs in the form of a scapular push-up or some serratus punches. Grant, I can send you a couple of these videos you can share with your listeners as well. Yeah, I've got
Yep.
quite a lot, or anyone can find this on my Distance Doctor Instagram. I've always got lots of videos on there. So that is a definite yes. I would involve your infraspinatus and your supraspinatus. So they're the ones that do that external rotation. They also stabilize the head of the humerus, that shoulder joint. So I would definitely include that. And that's going back to your kind of your traditional internal, external rotation, like your banded ones. But I would do them a lot harder intensity, even in your warm up. I would bring the reps down to about 8 repetitions and do them quite hard. So by rep number 8, you're feeling like, oh, I could only do maybe another 2 of those at that weight, and do them with really good technique. So you're getting a meaningful change in there. And then I would pick 3 exercises to start with. Let's say there are 2 of them. And then the third one I would do very similar, where I'd be working on more of those scapular stabilizers plus a little bit of core and back. So I would do something like a single arm bent over row. So I would pick 3 of those types of exercises in the activations and the warm up. And then I would pick about 2 main set exercises. And I would pick this, of course, based on each individual swimmer, but then you would bring those repetition ranges down quite a lot more. And I would do these as your heavy strength training to make that real meaningful performance difference. So when you're generally looking at your strength training in swimmers, often it's that maximal, that heavy strength training that you see the bigger performance changes with. So you got your injury prevention in your warm up, your main set, still injury prevention because you're building up that fatigue resistance in those muscles with this heavy strength training, but you also want to target your performance. So I would try and do these also single arm if you can. So of course a lat pull down is a great idea, but I would do an independent lat pull down. So that's on your cable machine with like the pins on each side, so you can't, compensate with one, or a kneeling single arm lat pull down. I find really good because then you're getting a heap of core and back strengthening in there as well. That's one of my real go-tos for swimmers. If you didn't pick a single arm bent over row in your activations, I would definitely do those as a heavy one, or like a bench pull. If you can do that with a heavy dumbbell, I find that really, really helpful too. So I'd be thinking more along the lines of those types of exercises, but heavier strength. So more like your 3 to 6 repetitions at loads, generally 85% of your 1RM or greater. You don't have to strength test to get those percentages. You can use more like your reps and reserves. So I'm talking by the time, let's say you're doing 4 sets of 5 repetitions, you want to be feeling like repetition number 5, you're going, you build up to this weight, obviously, but you'll be going, oof, I could probably only do 1, maybe about 1 more repetition with good technique at that weight. Then you're going to get those meaningful maximal strength improvements, which are going to help obviously your power throughout your movements and your general overall force, but that's also going to help your fatigue resistance, because every stroke is going to become relatively lower percentage of your maximal force there. So you're going to hopefully postpone those recruitment of more of your type 2 muscle fibers and just be more efficient in your stroke as well. So that was very that was a bit in depth. Sorry, Grant, I got carried away. You asked me my thing I'm passionate about, so I couldn't help it. I'll stop now.
That's good. I think one thing, as you mentioned earlier, and then you brought back again, was it's not doing 20 repetitions. It's looking at 3 to 6,
Yeah,
and really trying to generate some strength from that.
yeah, 100%. And then even in your activation type exercises, I would only do those scapular push-ups, make them challenging, only 10 reps, maximum 12 if you're focusing on those, or flip over and do some scapular punches with a heavy weight. Yeah, with your internal, external rotation, even in your warm-ups, like you don't want to be going crazy heavy. And with your main set, stick to those lower repetitions, maximum of 6 repetitions. 4 sets of 5, I find really good set and rep range for my swimmers. But also keep in mind, you don't want to fatigue yourself for your swim training. Like your strength training for swimmers is a means to an end. It's going to help you prevent injuries. It's going to help you perform better. So you keep that focus instead of just clogging in all these exercises, going higher rep ranges, because all you're going to do is make yourself really tired. I've worked with swimmers before who've come to me and they've been spending 90 minutes in the gym and been doing that 4 times a week, and they've told me their performance is getting worse. And I'm going, why? I can tell you why. So you're just doing too much and they're not getting adaptations.
You've mentioned earlier around doing 2 or 3 sessions a week.
Yeah.
How long should they take?
Yeah. Each of those gym sessions should take you 45 minutes, like no longer than that. I don't think, if you really enjoy the gym and you have the time, 60 minutes is great, but you could also bring it down to 30 minutes. You could get a really good quality session in, but the thing that you don't want to skip to make your gym session shorter is your rest periods for your main set. If you were doing 4 to 5 repetitions heavy loads, you need a minimum of 2 minutes of rest in between sets. And if you want to in that time, I say to my swimmers, look, if you just can't help yourself, because, you know, us long distance swimmers, we're all a little bit itchy and like to do a lot, you're allowed to go and sit on the seated calf raise, and you can work on some calf raises, you know, because your foot's in that plantar flex position. No problem. You can do that if you want to, but you're not allowed to use your upper body in that 2 minutes. That is 2 minutes of rest. And if you feel like 2 minutes of rest is too much, then your loads aren't heavy enough, because you should finish by your repetition number 4 or 5 and feel like, whoa, this is tough now. Okay. And you should want that 2 minutes of rest. So I say, go and be one of those typical gym junkies that sits down, looks like they're doing nothing. I give you permission to be one of those.
Just changing direction a little bit. Obviously, swimmers do get injured, and they probably struggle sometimes with knowing when to push through something or when to go and get help. So what would be
Mhm.
some of the warning signs that swimmers should say, oh, maybe I do actually need to go see a physio or a health professional?
Yeah, I have two, I guess, kind of rules that I would generally use. And swimmers can probably pick which one suits them both, or do a little bit of a combination of each. The first is a pain scale. And the reason I'm a little bit about this one is because everyone's pain levels are a little bit different. So people do need to be honest when they use this pain scale. The pain scale is your pain visual analog scale, where 0 is no pain at all and 10 is the worst imaginable pain. You can Google pain VAS and you'll see this come up on Google Images, and you can use that. So you can screenshot it, save it. And if your pain is a 0, a 1, a 2, or even a 3 out of 10, I generally say, look, you're fine to keep on training. It's okay. Like, because often stopping is the worst thing you can do. You don't want to stop training as soon as you get a niggle, take a little bit of time off, come back, take time off, come back, because then you're just getting inconsistent and your niggles will actually get worse and they won't actually go away. So generally, I say they are your safe zones. Research really strongly supports this in most musculoskeletal injuries across pretty much all sports. So I say you're fine to keep going. That is both during training and 24 hours after training as well. So it's not just during. People go, oh, it was fine, because often you might not feel that shoulder pain or back pain, whatever it is, until the next morning. So that's 24-hour behavior that would monitor on that pain scale. If it is a 4, 5, well, obviously above, then this comes into my second rule, which is generally like a 2 or 3 day niggle. Okay. And this is generally if you feel a niggle and it's more than that 3 out of 10, and you feel it the next day in a consecutive session and it's the same or worse, okay, look, you got to start considering changing. And I would change things up before you necessarily go and seek help. So I would shorten the session or remove the intensity. And if it's still there, then I'd say, do you know what? Just go and see someone, just get on top of it. And usually, if you do that and you follow those guidelines, your symptoms are going to settle and it's not going to turn into anything. But if you're ignoring those guidelines and you just keep on pushing through, that's where things can escalate. So they're my two general guidelines and rules that I give athletes, and they're pretty robust in the research as well. So that's what I would use.
So a bit more about you then. So you've started your own podcast, Distance
Yes.
Doctor in Practice. Can you tell us a bit about that and the type of topics you're exploring there?
Yeah, so it's funny, Grat, that you were one of my supervisors in we've both then ended up doing Rotto and started our pods. I love it. Great minds think alike. So this pod really came from, to be honest, I love to talk, in case you couldn't tell. And I was putting out lots of informative posts on Instagram and I was making them carousels. And I had so many questions that I felt like could really only be answered from a chat. And so I just really enjoyed sharing that knowledge and chatting. And I do some solo. I need to take a leaf out of your book though and get some more guests on. I've had guests, but it seems a lot easier to have guests on. So I need to do that. Get you on mine. And I chat about all things endurance training, performance and injury prevention. So this is for swimmers, cyclists and runners and triathletes. For example, we went over the new 10% rule. So we've all heard of like the 10% rule in training, don't increase training by more than 10%. Well, what is that? And there was actually a phenomenal study that was released this last year about reconsidering the 10% rule and how to actually apply that. So I did a deep dive into that study and broke that down and applied it practically. I've chatted about injuries. I just did a 2-part series on bone stress injuries with a dietitian. So I got her perspective in. Strength training, of course, is in there. So it's all the things that I try and take what the research says, I simplify it, and then I put it practically so listeners can go, okay, that's what that study meant, and this is how I can apply it in my training, or how can I apply it to my injury that I have. So that's my goal, is to go, here's the study, here's what it means, this is what you should do about it or not do about it, because often I find there's just so much noise out there at the moment. I'm sure, as you're aware, Grant, so much on social media too, then you go, which one is good, helpful information, which ones belong in the bin?
There is a lot of good research out there,
Mhm.
but the translation to the general public, to those that actually want to utilise that information, is always the challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we find it a challenge, right? And you figure, well, if I find it a challenge and this is what I do, it's so hard for other people out there. And then also I do find a lot of the time on social media, the people who just talk really loud, and the way that they translate the information is quite in your face, and it's almost hard to ignore, but it doesn't mean it's right. So I try and be that voice of, hang on, this is actually what it means, and this is, yes, you should apply it, or no, consider this. So that's what I try and do, very much like yourself with this. You get, the good information out there to your athletes so they can be empowered to know themselves as well.
So outside of the podcast at the moment, what other work are you doing with athletes?
Yeah, I work with a heap of athletes actually all across the world, which is phenomenal. And I couldn't believe I could do strength training online until COVID hit, and that changed everything. But as it turns out, you can, and it works really, really well, actually. So I've got athletes literally all across the world. I work with a lot of triathletes, high level, recreational, all levels, all athletes. And I mainly do their strength training and training load management. So if they have injuries, I'll go over their training programs, like what we'd sort of discussed earlier in this episode. I create their strength training programs for both injury prevention and performance. So it depends on the athlete. I really do enjoy working with athletes who have their niggles sort of at bay, or I love working with athletes where they currently have an injury. We manage it, we get it to settle down, and then we progress on to, now we strength train for performance. That's probably my favorite type of athletes to work with. And yeah, we just get them to the start line injury free, and then to the finish line faster than they've done before. And I absolutely love it. It's great. Yeah, it's my favorite thing. I'm so happy this is my career.
Right at the start, you mentioned having a challenge with endometriosis
Mhm.
and how that sort of moved you away a little bit from running, more into swimming. Obviously, you've gone back to some running again. Is there anything else you'd like to share around that space?
Yeah. Well, this is a very good question. I have struggled with my endometriosis for 10 years now. And when I first got diagnosed, I wouldn't even have mentioned it on this pod, right? Because the awareness wasn't there. And now it is. And I do think it's quite prevalent in the swimming space, because do think there are a lot of people like me who have gone more to swimming because they struggle with their endo with other sports. I actually did do a research study into elite athletes with endometriosis. A lot of swimmers responded. And from this, we asked the athletes, what would you like to see changed in your training, or what do you want to make a difference to your quality of life? And I've asked myself the same questions, and what they responded and what I thought were very similar. And it's that, give yourself permission to have a sleep in if you don't feel well, or to even have your coach know what you have and make a change for you. Or if you're still up and you want to go and train, but you're feeling like rubbish and you're having a flare up, I have personally found that movement makes it better, but the right movement. So strength training and running were just no's for me. They would just flare up my symptoms. And I used to try and trudge through, and I'd just send myself in a hole. And it honestly took me about 4 or 5 years to realize what I was almost sort of doing to myself, until I learnt, listen to your body and go, okay, do you know what? I still want to go to the pool, or I still want to go for a swim, but maybe instead of going to the pool, I'm going to go to the beach. I'm going to go for an open water swim because I know that's good for my headspace. And I'm just going to tick my arms over. I'm not even going to take my watch with me. I don't even want to know, but I'll go and do that for my mindset. And just giving myself permission to do that and to not feel bad about it is probably the biggest thing that I've learned. And I hope if there are any listeners that are listening to this, and if they have endometriosis or any chronic health condition, I think I used to trudge through. I used to almost ignore it because I would think if I ignore it, I'll manage it really well. And that's just not the way to go. You don't have to lean into it fully because it's not exactly, your only identity. But I think just acknowledging it and giving yourself grace and just going, look, it is what it is, but I'm still here. I'm going to do my event. I'm still going to do my thing. And that's not even every event. I've lost so much money in race entries because my endo's flared up and I've not been able to do the race. But just knowing that's just who I am and it's okay. I'm still going to do an event. I'm still going to do this. If you're listening, I really hope this resonates with you if it is you, and just not being harsh on yourself and just modifying things. And even the elites, and I'm talking, we interviewed Olympic level swimmers, and they still wish they had been nicer to themselves and made modifications. So if they're saying it, we can definitely say it.
Thanks for sharing that. And the only other thing I'd like you, if you can, is maybe for those that don't understand what it is, could you,
Yeah.
in a nutshell, just give a bit of a background?
Yeah, of course. So endometriosis is where this is actually Endometriosis Awareness Month. So I'm really glad you're asking these questions, Grant. It's where cells similar to the lining of the endometrium grow outside of your uterus. So this can be on your ovaries, it can be anywhere, not even in your pelvic cavity. It can be anywhere in your body. It can grow on your diaphragm. I had some on my bladder and my bowel. There has even been findings of it in the nose and in the calf muscles, which is just mind blowing. So it can be anywhere in the body. And what happens when those cells become inflamed or they shear or they bleed, that can cause a heap of pain, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, all sorts of symptoms, just general tummy aches, back aches. Mine always presented in the form of back aches, and I never really knew what they were from. And then I started getting the pelvic pain. And that is what endometriosis is. The symptoms are different for everybody as well. So people often think it's cyclical pain, so it only comes when women have their period. But that's not actually the case. For example, mine was always ovulation time, which I found I was the anomaly on that, and it never really made sense to me. Why does this particular random time of the month hurt for me? It's not when I'm bleeding or anything. So it's really important to recognize everyone's symptoms are different. When I was diagnosed, it was 1 in 11 women had endometriosis, and now it's actually 1 in 7. And that's only of those who are diagnosed. So it's probably even more prevalent. I'm sure if you said to your friend, oh, Kate talked about this thing called endometriosis, I can guarantee in a group of people you talk to, someone would say, I have that, or my sister has that, or, whoever it is, it's definitely getting more awareness. But yeah, hopefully that explains it.
The opportunity to share information like that, I think, is really important because, as you say, until people have had that conversation and they realise they're not the only one, and then they're more likely to have those conversations.
Yeah, and even just knowing you're not the only one, and if someone else in your swim squad, or, even if, like, I remember having a flare up not that long ago. Mine's been wreaking havoc with me recently, and I had to go to ED because mine was so bad. And the doctor had said to me, my wife is currently struggling with this. She's at home at the moment. And, even just hearing him say that made me go, he gets it. Like, I know that he gets it because he's seen it firsthand. So if you can find someone in your squad or in your swimming community who gets it, or has at least they want to get it, they want to ask you, then that is really important too. Or just appreciates it, or just goes, do you know what? You don't even have to tell me anymore. I can totally understand. I can see the way you look or the way that you're feeling. It's cool. Just swim easy today, or whatever. Just to feel heard, I think, is really important.
All right, a couple of quick ones to finish.
Yeah.
So I ask everyone this question. So, what is your favourite swim set or session?
For me, it's the red mist session, so the 10 400s with 60 seconds of rest. But then I would total it. So that's obviously your 4K, but I would total the session as a 5K. And I used to do that in my Rotto build. I would do 7K on a Thursday, 7K on a Friday, and then my big 2 swims on the weekend. So I'd back end my weeks. But that Friday red mist one that I would tie in, I'll bulk it up. At the time, Sally Scafidi, who was my mentor through my Rotto training, she would take me through that session. She would push me so hard, but I used to just thrive off it. And she was on my boat for Rotto. And she said to me at the end, at the 15K mark, Kate, one red mist session left. And I just smiled, and it was just the most perfect thing she could have said. And I thought, yeah, like, let's go this last, red mist session. So absolutely 10 400, 60 seconds of rest, and just banging it for those 400s. And I just love it.
So whenever I ask this question, I try and embed it into my following set for the rest of the squad.
Oh no, I'm
And
sorry.
most of them, this is going to be the most challenging I've had so far.
Oh, it has to be 5K total though, okay? It's not red mist unless it's 5K total. So you can do 500 warm up with some technique drills, 10 fours, max out. You want to spew by the last one, a 500 struggle street, some form of a cool down. So sorry to all your swimmers. I apologize.
Lastly, just is there anything that we haven't touched on that you really think is important for swimmers or endurance athletes to understand that you might want to share?
Do you know, and this is going to be for your newer listeners, because I know that a lot of your listeners are already accomplished swimmers. But I remember when I did Roto, I raced a lot of people that I went to swim squad with, and a lot of them were a lot faster than me. And I swam so much faster than them on the day. And I think that was because I did all my quality swims with the swim squad, but I did a lot of open water swimming. And I think my thing is like, just get in the open water. And I know that sounds so captain obvious, but I think that I did a lot faster than them because I was just used to the conditions. And our conditions on the day were so rough and so choppy, but I just was used to it because I would make myself go regardless of the conditions and go, you could get anything on the day. And I just thrived on that. I was used to the water temperature. I was used to feeling a little bit seasick from it. So if there's anyone newer, maybe doing roto for the first time, that would be like my biggest thing that I think helped. And of course, I'm going to be biased. So I've just make the time for strength training.
Wonderful. Kate, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast today. I really appreciate the knowledge that you've been able to share with everybody. I'm sure they're really going to enjoy this episode.
Oh, thank you, Grant. Thanks so much for asking me.
You're welcome. Thanks so much for listening to the Science and Art of Open Water Swimming. A huge thank you to Dr. Kate Baldwin for such an insightful and honest conversation. From injury prevention and strength training to navigating training load, sleep, stress, and everything that sits around our sport. I'm really grateful to Kate for not only sharing her expertise, but for being so open about the lived experience behind it. Conversations like this help strengthen our community and remind us that performance, health, and support all go hand in hand. If you enjoyed this chat, please make sure you check out Kate's own podcast, DistanceDr In Practice, where she dives deeper into endurance performance, injury management, and the science behind smart, sustainable training. If you found value in today's episode, please share it with a friend or someone in your squad who might benefit from Kate's wisdom. And if you've got any questions or topics you'd like me to explore next, just reach out. Until next time, I'll see you in the water.